Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is April 6th, and on behalf of the Clue Plus Research Institute, I would like to welcome you to the second webinar series of Black Lives Past and Present. My name is Aaron Peter, and as a FU alumnus, I'm honored to be your moderator today. I work for the Educational Projects Department of the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. I develop, manage, and implement projects combating anti-Semitism, discrimination, and racism that enable youth to make their voices heard in traveling exhibitions and in film workshops. In recent months, we have been reawakened by loud voices of anger and sorrow at the injustice called racism. They speak of violence that kills people. They also speak of hidden power structures in our society that put people at a disadvantage because of fewer opportunities to develop themselves or because of ethnic profiling. The Research Institute Clue Plus of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam wishes to take part in the courageous conversations about uncomfortable questions with sometimes painful answers. By organizing a series of webinars on the history of slavery, colonialism, institutional racism, and violence, we hope to contribute to these conversations with insights from history. Today we have three presenters, and I would like to invite you to a discussion with all three of them following their presentations. The Under Cover of Darkness exhibition at the Slave Lodge in Cape Town intended to surface the stories of 12 women in servitude during the early Dutch colonial occupation at the Cape of Good Hope as means to render this history more visible. Recently, the exhibition hosted a symposium titled Uncovering Women's Invisible Labor in the Cape. In both the exhibition and the symposium, the legacies of women's labor in the Cape were traced from colonialism to contemporary times. They sought to highlight how labor practices in the Cape, especially the clothing and textile industries, as well as the service and cleaning industries, continue patterns established during colonialism and through slavery. The project as a whole advocates for recognition of invisible labors of care and the pressures brought to bear on those who perform it. Under Cover of Darkness, Gender, Labor, and Race in the Cape, from the colonial period to the present, is the title of our presentation today, and it is a great pleasure for me to introduce the presenters. Karine Zijman is an artist, curator, and scholar committed to critical engagement with colonial archives and collections, specifically those holding strands of Khoekhoe pasts. Bringing intangible and neglected histories into view is a key motivation for her work. Her research aims to contribute to a radical reconsideration of colonial archives and museum collections, especially by assisting in finding ways to release their hold over our imaginations when we narrate the past, as well as how we might shape futures from it. She obtained a PhD in fine art from the University of Cape Town in 2019 and worked as a senior lecturer for its Michaelis School of Fine Art and the Center for Curating the Archive until then. At present, Zijman is a postdoctoral fellow at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam as a team member in the Worlding Public Cultures project. Jade Nair is a project manager at the University of Cape Town's Center for Curating the Archive. She has been part of the center since 2013 and been involved in various curatorial, archival, and research projects, including exhibitions, documentaries, and digital archives dealing with political history, queer archives, and the clothing and textile industry. Much of her work has been centered on the afterlife of apartheid in the form of land restitution and the effects of South Africa's socioeconomic structure on vulnerable populations. Having grown up in Cape Town, the history and heritage of the Western Cape is a significant part of her research. She is currently completing her honors degree in curatorship at the University of Cape Town. And finally, Nina Liebenberg is an artist, a curator, and a lecturer at the University of Cape Town's Center for Curating the Archive. She has been teaching on the Honors Curatorship Program since 2013 and has facilitated annual interdisciplinary workshops for the program, using curation as methodology to explore various overlaps and connections between diverse university departments. As a PhD candidate, her current research is focused on disciplinary object collections as covert markers of the colonial and apartheid regimes, and curatorship and art marketing as methodologies able to address these histories through uncovering and extending the meaning of these material depositories beyond their disciplinary scope. For questions throughout the presentation, please forward your questions by using the Zoom Q&A function, and we will address them at the end of this presentation. Corinne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen, if that's all right. And please let me know if this is in order. Can you see that? Good. Thank you, Aaron, for that introduction, and also for CLU Plus for inviting us. It is interesting to be coming from a space such as Cape Town into this arena, and I was interested by your webinar series thinking about the history of Dutch colonialism, and that is very much, I think, what all three of us will be looking at today, through the prism of the Under Cover of Darkness project, which comprises both an exhibition at this stage and then a symposium to which Jade and Nina will speak a little later. My focus will be on the exhibition. Under Cover of Darkness is a project concerned with the history of women in servitude, especially slavery in Cape Town. In its first manifestation, the project was realized as an exhibition at the Iziko Slave Lodge and drew on the collections of the Iziko Social History Center. The exhibition is not considered to be a static instantiation. Instead, the exhibition space was conceived to function as a prompt for continuing engagement with this history and was used as a venue to stage panel discussions, meetings, and performances. The project wanted to bring into consciousness the legacies of slavery in post-apartheid Cape Town. In order to bring about this consciousness, the project focused on the lost, buried, or fragmentally present narratives of individual women whose voices cannot be reconstructed simply by reference to colonial archives. Under Cover of Darkness employed consultative, creative, and artistic methods of curation intended to evoke a sense of the women's narrative, not as distant historical figures, but as presences that we can relate to. So in this presentation throughout, we will be drawing attention to some invisible labors, that of care, but also the pressures brought to bear on those who have to perform this labor. These images are of a space in Cape Town called the Company's Gardens. As you can see, and the Company's Gardens was a site that the first Dutch colonial governor, Jan van Riebeeck, established a garden that was going to serve as a refreshment station for ships as they were passing to and from the East Indies. Under Cover of Darkness was born from a desire to upend the naturalized, unconscious assignation of slavery as belonging to the deep past and the undervaluing of women's labor in particular. We wanted to turn the rooms accommodating the exhibition into spaces where the unseen is transformed into the seen. In order to arrive at the Slave Lodge, one inevitably has to negotiate a path through an improbably varied melange of people and buildings, street performers entertaining red-faced tourists in floppy hats and sandals, informal traders selling souvenirs and fruit next to St. George's Cathedral, barristers and politicians in somber suits hurrying onto their next important meeting. The city around the Slave Lodge frames every visit to the site, and as such should move us to pause for thought. Right next to the museum is the South African Parliament, the site where apartheid laws were enacted. The proximity of these buildings reminds us of how the very structures of colonialism and apartheid continue to structure life and labor in South Africa. With Under Cover of Darkness, we sought to make the largely unacknowledged role of slavery in the persisting legacy of inequality apparent, especially as it concerned the invisible labor performed by women in the city. Throughout the exhibition, we endeavored to dislodge the dominance of colonial objects as the means whereby this history can be narrated, and placing them in conversations with the stories that are absent from the collection, but urgently needed to be told. And so in this presentation, that is what I'm trying to speak to say how we did that. This is the space in which the exhibition was staged, the Iziko Slave Lodge. It is a museum housed in the building where enslaved people lived between 1679 and 1811. It stands at the centre of Cape Town, at the end of the company's gardens. As Cape Townians still call it, even to this day, it hasn't been renamed. The company, a name we form in our mouths almost unthinkingly, refers, of course, to the VOC. Dotted throughout the cityscape are reminders of the company's occupation of the region. Some are self-consciously erected markers, such as statues and street names commemorating the period, while others are lodged in the very materiality of its infrastructure, not least of all in the spatial design of the city itself. Cape Town carries its past on its sleeve, but on one issue, it is rather silent. Whose labour built the city and whose labour is keeping it going? The issue of slavery in the city receives relative or comparatively little attention and is often relegated as belonging to the very distant past, especially in view of more urgent issues for most of the 20th century, namely through apartheid. What is more, the extent to which slavery set in motion the extractive labour conditions arranged along both lines of both race and gender that still characterise the city is largely downplayed in the manner that Cape Town publicly rehearses its history. Race, patriarchy and labour continue to constitute the most challenging issues faced in contemporary South Africa, but the patterns of the organisation, we should remember, were established in the early Cape Colony. The Iziko Slave Lodge is tied also to the Iziko Social History Centre. And the Slave Lodge itself functioned as a cultural history museum in the late 20th century and had to transform itself into speaking more apparently and openly about slavery. However, it had not yet produced an exhibition focusing particularly on women. And it is because of this aspect that I was invited through Iziko and the producer of the exhibition, Josephine Grunrod, to curate an exhibition on this area. And Josephine was particularly captivated by the story of Susanna van Bengal, and that is where we started with the project. And seeing that we are looking in this webinar at some of this history, I thought it is worth reciting her story here. Susanna arrived at the Cape as a female convict in 1658. She had been an enslaved person in Batavia, and no record survives of the crimes she committed that caused the VOC to cut off her ear and banish her to the Cape. Her mutilation and name, Ian Oor, was intended to taint her as a hardened criminal for life. Susanna lived at the Slave Lodge and was made to work in the company's garden. She had a son, Andries, and in 1666, and a daughter, Elsje, born 3 years later. Both children were baptized, which means each must have had a European father, because only half-slag children were permitted to be baptized. When Elsje was about 6 months old, Susanna was convicted of her murder. Susanna, infected with smallpox, was arrested, was tortured, and confessed. Her confession, made under torture from the thumbscrew, was that she had returned, sick with fever, from a day's work in the gardens. She could produce no milk of her own to feed her child. She could not stop the child screaming, and none of the other women was prepared to suckle the child or to help her. Being sick, she could no longer bear her predicament and resolved to end it. Susanna was convicted of Elsje's murder and sentenced to death. The court's judgment concluded that Susanna had totally lost her natural instinct for love as a mother. On 13 December 1669, Susanna's sentence was read out loud in the square in front of the fort. Susanna was then escorted to the roadstead. Before the assembled enslaved people of the company, she was sewn into a bag with rocks and dumped alive into Table Bay. Susanna's story then is one that speaks of the intersection of motherhood and labor and care, and who is it that gives this, who gives these, and who is it that receives. Whoops, seem to have gone too far. Another story that I brought quite early into the discussion is that of Krutua. Here you will see that the story that I'm reading to you, that's been translated into Khoekhoegap. Krutua was a Gorongakona Khoikhoi woman who acted as a translator between the Khoikhoi and the Dutch in the early colonial settlement at the Cape of Good Hope during the mid-17th century. Krutua labored in this role, which is most often framed as one of being in between, belonging neither in the Kwena nor the Dutch societies. She labored to gain agency to affect the circumstances of her own life. However, after the death of her Danish husband and the departure of Jan van Riebeeck, the first Dutch governor at the Cape, the conditions of her life became unmanageable. Colonial records reveal the colonizers' incomprehension at her subsequent behavior, which they describe as disorderly. When Krutoa died in 1674, the official VOC diarist remarked, and I quote, "With the dogs, she returned to her own vomit, a clear illustration that nature, no matter how tightly muzzled by imprinted moral principles, reverts to its inborn qualities," end quote. In the present day, Krutoa is often commemorated as a victim. That is, she is cast as a proxy for all those who suffered colonial oppression, but whose lives escape the records. In these narrations, her unruly behavior later in life is frequently edited out in favor of depicting her oppression or of casting her as the mother of the Rainbow Nation, so-called. Sorry, I don't know. Mother of the name so-called Rainbow Nation. Her life story stands in service in this manner to present-day narratives that are penned not only by historians, but also by writers of fiction and drama, as well as visual artists. So this is another point at which we started, the one being Susanna and then this, because in South Africa also the plight of indigenous peoples, together with enslaved people that were imported, have kind of commingled and are part of the same legacy. Having these points of departure, they were led into the storerooms of the Izika Social History Center. And this is a photograph of some of the boxes in the storeroom, and the museum was quite interested in me using the so-called manacles, and were very persistent with suggesting that these be included in the exhibition. But I resisted this. I was kept wondering, what am I making visible, and why represent this cruelty? To what end? Who would be affected by it? So from the get-go then, from these stories, it became apparent that the choice of objects to be used is going to be very important. One of the objects that immediately did announce itself to our attention was this knitted baby cap. And it would be interesting maybe to understand that this cap is the size of this cap is that of the head of an infant, a newborn infant. So it is very small, incredibly delicate. And so predictably, our ambition to bring to life the past was simpler to conceive than to achieve. Since the naturalization of slave ownership and extractive labor practices does not cease at the door of the museum, Izika's very collection has been shaped by the interests of those who considered enslaved people their property, rather than of those people whose labor was alienated through enslavement. Consequently, the vast majority of the objects in the museum's collection associated with the period belong to Europeans. We nevertheless tasked ourselves with finding means whereby these objects could be mobilized to give shape to the stories of enslaved women and women in servitude, and make this legacy apparent. Another object that announced itself to our attention is this bell it's a slave bell from the Oranjezicht farm. On the right, you can see that it was used in an exhibition called Goede Hoop, Zuid-Afrika en Nederland vanaf 1600, which was at the Rijksmuseum in 2017. So on the left, you can see that bell has just returned from that exhibition into the storeroom. Also note the way that it was exhibited at the Rijksmuseum in an elevated way, almost as a clock that can still work. But its appearance in the storeroom was quite instructive to me. It's almost as if it come to the storeroom as just another object, quite muted. Now I'll return to the bell a little bit later. We are understanding that the limits posed by the object in their capacity to tell the stories we wanted to tell, we sought something other than the objects to bring the presences of the people to light. So we returned to the archives, and through archival research, selected the stories of 10 more women, apart from Susanna and Krutoa, to feature in our exhibition. The 12 lives brought to light under the Under Cover of Darkness exhibition try to stand in for the many stories that will never be told of women forced into slavery and oppressive labor under colonialism. The challenge of the exhibition was to find a way to bring these women's lives out of darkness. Most lives passed unrecorded. Women under servitude were written about only when they intersected with the colonial project, most commonly as property bought or sold when they broke colonial laws, or in the rare instances when a woman freed herself and became a property owner. Most women living under these conditions never owned anything. The exhibition had to find ways to animate stories with very little evidence of the material lives of its subjects. It is also important to understand that these 12 stories constitute quite a range of experiences. There are women who lived and died under servitude, those who managed to gain freedom. There are women who had documented lives, and those who went very, very much unrecorded, except for one entry. There are women who were born at the Cape, and there are those who stolen from other places. And I wanted to show you these 2 pages. This is the part of a archival entry of Magdalena van Batavia. And as you can see here, it says that the only way for an enslaved mother to save her children was to free herself and then buy her own children. So in these documents, that is what Magdalena was doing. She was trying to buy her own children, but unfortunately died before the sale had become formal. And so she left her daughter still officially enslaved. So archives and collections have the same problem. They retain the colonial history, not that of the people whose lives are obscured by these petrifying technologies. So in the exhibition, we had to employ various curatorial strategies to unsettle the primacy of the colonial. So one of the strategies by which we did this, or tried to do this, was by introduction of works by 2 contemporary artists who were already grappling with these issues. Importantly, both of these artists brought in their manifestation senses of embodiment. They conveyed the subjective as well as the affective. In my strategies, then I tried to produce its juxtapositions or call and response between some of the colonial objects and these contemporary artworks. You can see the bell is now featured in the exhibition in this slide, but it is encased, it is quiet, it is on the ground, it is not able to make a sound. On the right, you will see a work that was commissioned for the exhibition. It is called Elegy, Louisa van der Kaap by Gabrielle Goliath, and it forms part of her Elegy series. As you enter, this is the final room of the exhibition, but as you enter at the beginning, you are called forward through the exhibition by the sound of these women singing. They hold a single note, slowly, mournfully, and it becomes increasingly louder as you progress through the exhibition, until you arrive at the end to see this actual performance. The performance was also staged at the opening of the exhibition. Before anybody could go into the exhibition, there was this long performance in which these women performed this elegy for Louisa van der Kaap. This notion of invocation, this notion of gathering together is something that you will hear a little bit more about later, as it is something that being physically present together in a space was something that was quite important for the exhibition, to physically stand and reflect on the subject matter of the exhibition. A work by another artist, Azazol Ndamaze, also played in this notion of call and response, this juxtaposition of the work that she did with a dress that is labeled by the Iziko Social History Collection as follows: a dress made by an enslaved woman with a belt in the 1830s style. It says then, it has been alluded that this dress may have been made by an enslaved woman, but she would not have worn it. On the left is Azazolo Ndamase's untitled 30 May 2018. Tasked with finding an object in the slave lodge to respond to, Azazolo could find none and could not relate to anything in the museum itself. Instead, she took off her own worker's jacket that she wore with her visit to the museum and adorned it with artificial braids. The exhibition wanted to bring in affect, as I hope I have indicated already. It wanted to create a space for commemorating and mourning, but to do so required to bring into the exhibition space elements that are not depicting, that are not representational, another means by which to move away from the objects. So the archival slivers to which we have access and the collections that are not representative of the people whose stories we wanted to tell, we really were interested in notions of absence. But how do you curate absence? This is a model of the slave lodge on the right. That is what the slave lodge looked like at the time that it housed enslaved people. And there's a floor plan of the building on the left. Our guiding principle of curatorship was to make visible what is absent. But our question also concerned which slave lodge did we instantiate? The Grand Museum building is not the one that the enslaved people lived in. It is an institution that today contributes to the forgetting rather than the remembering. But the question remains, can an exhibition really do anything? It might be important to remember that what is at stake in the Netherlands might be different to that in South Africa. The audiences in South Africa have a desire for these histories to be acknowledged, and generally it is understood to be a recuperative gesture. This is one of the reasons we used Afrikaans, isiXhosa, and English throughout the exhibition, because we know that language already imagines an audience. I remind you here just of the proximity between the slave lodge and Parliament. This is also something that I instantiated by inserting pictures that make that relationship more apparent. As we closed the exhibition last week, we commissioned the poet Toni Giselle Stewart to write a poem about the 13 women focused in the exhibition, so the 12 women plus Louisa van der Kaap from Gabrielle Goliath's work. I was struck by her repeated refrain, "We sing you home." And I thought about how, by standing for everyone whose lives have been left out of the records, these women have again been put to work. And this is the responsibility of curatorship, to understand the work that we have made these women do. The project now has a different future, and it's something to which Jade and Nina will speak. But it might be interesting to just note that even as our exhibition was up, the bell was again transported back and is currently at the Rijksmuseum. So when the museum's open and you can go and see the Rijksmuseum exhibition and you see our bell, just remind yourself of the empty space that it has left at the Iziko Slave Lodge in Cape Town. Thank you.
Thank you, Karine.
Thanks,
Nina,
Karine.
would you like to?
Yes, I will. Okay. Jade and I were brought in by Karine and Josephine in October of last year in order to assist with expanding the Under Cover of Darkness project. Besides Josie, we were all familiar with each other, having worked together at the Center for Curating the Archive for many, many years. It was probably our joint affiliation with the CCA and the methodologies that we formulated for our various roles in this research center that informed the way we approached our task of further developing the exhibition and its themes. The CCA promotes a very interdisciplinary way of working, which manifests not only in its teaching programs, but also in the varied archival depositories it draws on, and the various spaces and diverse publics with which its research intersects. On first visiting the exhibition and having a chat in the Slave Lodge courtyard, Jade and I realized that it would be very hard to add anything to the exhibition itself. Every aspect of it was so carefully considered and sensitively curated that adding or subtracting from it would do it an injustice. We therefore decided to rather look out, beyond the exhibition space, to the city in which it is situated, and to consider how the themes the exhibition introduced manifest in the city and its history.
As Nina noted, the exhibition was curated so thoroughly by Karine in its telling of women's servitude in the early Cape that we felt the most meaningful way to add to this project was to look to the contemporary and to find those strands of the legacy of servitude which still prevails in many industries. It was pertinent for us to create panels that were diverse, inclusive, and gave a platform to voices beyond academia. As such, each panel included an academic whose research has contributed to and grown a conversation relating to the history of women, their work, and the industries which rely on them. However, we also conscientiously invited panelists who could speak firsthand from personal experience. This manifested in our program through the immigrant voices, the queer voices, and the displaced voices. Our program was split into 3 segments: Gathering, Repast, and Matinee. Gathering was an acknowledgement of the histories of servitude and women's work in the public sphere, It was a space to consider the legacies of slavery and colonialism and the contemporary sex work industry. The next segment, Repast, focused on the legacy of women's labor and food and invited contemporary practitioners who are using food as a medium to trace heritage, consumption, and labor practices in the food industry. The closing segment, Matinee, which opened with a documentary screening, provided three distinct perspectives on the labor of fashion: fashion and textile factory workers, the fashion of labor and the politics of uniforms, and the role of fashion in the performance of identity. My own relationship with legacies of servitude has been something I've always accessed through my heritage. Being a person of color in the Cape, of mixed race, much of the socio-political condition of South Africa predetermined the trajectories of many of my forefathers into lives of servitude. However, it was only upon moving into the historical city center that I began to see the physical manifestation of slavery and servitude. I live on Darling Street, so where the black dot is, from which I have a clear vantage point of some of the many fragments of the painful history of slavery and segregation in this country, including the Grand Parade, where the purple dot is, a marketplace where enslaved people were sold and publicly punished, and the Castle of Good Hope, a little further down, a Dutch East India building where enslaved people served colonial leaders. In the opposite direction, I then have the vantage point of the Iziko Slave Lodge, where the red dot is, now a social history museum, but was originally used to house enslaved people owned by the Dutch East India Company. Living in an area whose spatial planning and architecture has been so defined by slavery and the legacy of colonial rule is made especially difficult when the legacy of those atrocities is still evident when thousands of Black and colored people are trained, bused, and taxied in every morning to serve the restaurants, homes, and businesses of the city and out again in the evening. Of these thousands of workers who commute to the City Bowl daily, clothing and textile factory workers make up a large contingent, serving the clothing and textile factories in Woodstock and Salt River. The legacy of slavery is apparent still in many ways, not least of all in industrialized organization of labor, which is most apparent in Cape Town in the clothing, textile, and fashion industries. The local clothing industry employed almost 250,000 people at its peak in the early 90s, before the South African borders opened for trade after the first democratic election. Whilst this number is now much lower, it is still an industry that ticks because of the labor of women of color, many of whom solely support households of up to 10 dependents on minimum wages, whilst navigating life in communities in the grips of the byproducts of the legacies of displacement, such as gang violence, addiction, and abuse. Our matinee segment, which focused on this industry, was curated as a platform to uncover some of the realities of this industry. Our strategy of selection for this panel was based on a desire to uncover multidisciplinary perspectives on this industry that were diverse and made for nuanced discussion. Professor Sheena O'Connell operates from the positionality of being a descendant of enslaved peoples and uses her work as an act of refusal, both in the stories she tells and the platforms she chooses, this documentary film being an example. Dr. Erica de Greef then works from the position of being a fashion scholar and uncovers stories of labor practices, appropriation, and identity through the visual language of fashion. Her current work focuses on the politics of uniform, both as work garment and fashion trend, both of which reaffirm the invisibility of women labor. Queasy is a performance artist whose work takes many forms, but is always concerned with making visible the lives of people who are so often marginalized. A fashion design graduate, Queasy designs, makes, and wears garments as an act of assertion and performs in them as an act of taking ownership of city spaces. These three voices of Sheena, Erica, and Queasy in conversation brought to light that whilst many marginalized lives might be rendered invisible by the powers that be, those lives are not only essential to many of the functions of society, but are nuanced and colored in individual and unexpected ways. Thank you.
Sorry, Aaron. I'm going to try to be as quickly as possible.
No worries, you go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Okay. In trying to decide what my section of this presentation will entail, I decided to focus not on the activities which occurred on the day itself, but on something of an addendum activity, which usually occurs after a symposium, if at all, but which we decided we would do the week beforehand. The symposium, The symposium, which Jade, Corinne and I started planning last year in November for March this year, was always going to be a virtual online one, even though 8 of our 9 panelists are situated in Cape Town or the greater Cape Town area. What their location and proximity did afford us, we realized, was the opportunity to hand-deliver thank you gifts to them personally a week beforehand, wearing masks and socially distanced, of course. So after a year and a half of being sequestered in our individual homes, Jade in the City Bowl, Corinne in Utrecht, and myself in the seaside suburb of Muizenberg, Jade and I met on the morning of the 17th of March outside the Trafalgar Place flower market in order to buy individually curated bouquets of flowers for each panelist. Prior to this day, we plotted each of the panelists' addresses on our Google map and worked out the most efficient way to navigate these deliveries. It is in the unfolding of the journey of this day that I feel an additional aspect of the symposium and the issues that it aimed to address was uncovered. In the span of the 7 hours it took to do these deliveries, the city and how it is geographically organized and structured continue to reveal the legacies of first slavery and colonialism, and then the apartheid legislation, and how these had worked to mold it into its current form, as both Jade and Corinne has also spoken about. It revealed the privileges it still afforded to some and how it continued to disenfranchise others, whilst the various spatial arrangements also told the stories of different communities and their heritage. In briefly running through the location of a few of these deliveries, I hope to give you a sense of these different sides to the city, which each of our panelists call home. As briefly stated, Jade and I met at the Trafalgar Place market first thing on the morning of the 17th of March, where Soraya Naidu, Alison Snyders, and Karen Bachman made up the various bouquets of flowers. In including these bouquets as part of the symposium, we aim to acknowledge the labor of these women and their histories, and to bring their stories into the scope of the project. Established in 1860, the market is one of the few places in the city where people of color could continue to trade after the Group Areas Act of 1950 segregated this section of the city for white-only businesses. Most of these traders commute into town each day from their homes in Mitchell's Plain, Manenberg, and Lotus River, the areas to which their families were moved in 1961, after the Group Areas Act stipulated that the land on which they lived and cultivated their flowers in Constantia was a white group area. Named after the Dutch colonial governor of Cape Town, Simon van der Stel, who in 1685 established his wine farm, Groot Constantia, and a few other farms in the area, and on which almost 220 enslaved individuals worked. This leafy suburb, situated very close to the city bowl, was, after emancipation from the mid-1800s to the 1960s, the home to many of these now freed individuals, who continue to farm their own lands and grow, amongst other things, the flowers sold at the market. After the forced removal from their land in Constantia, Soraya, Alison, and Karen's grandmothers would continue to travel into town to sell their flowers within the segregated space to their white clientele, who didn't want to venture out too far in order to acquire the lilies, roses, proteas, African daisies, asters, various types of fynbos, wild irises, sunflowers, and adenium daisies they needed to beautify their homes. After acquiring the bouquets, the first delivery took us to Walmer Estate, a suburb situated at the foot of Table Mountain, and one which formed part of the former District 6. The centrally located 6th municipal district of the city, in which a lively community made up of former enslaved persons, many from Indonesia or the East Indies as it was known then, brought to South Africa by the Dutch East India Company during its administration of the Cape Colony, and artisans, merchants, and other immigrants lived. The forced removals, which started in 1966, resulted in more than 60,000 people that were relocated to the sandy and bleak Cape Flats area, roughly 25 kilometers away from the city centre. Walmer Estate is one of the few surviving remnants of this history. After making our delivery to the panelist parents, we made our way to Oranjezicht. This section of the city, situated on the slopes of Table Mountain, with magnificent views over the city and Table Bay, is one of the most affluent areas in Cape Town. Built on the site of the old Oranjezicht farm, called this because of the view of the Oranje bastion of the Castle of Good Hope, for which it supplied fresh produce. The properties here are still almost exclusively white-owned. The slave bell, which featured in the exhibition and which Corinne also spoke about, also came from here when it was still the Oranjezicht farm and owned by the Van Breda family. The bell was commissioned in 1775 by the family, and with its instatement, regulated the lives of the 19 male enslaved individuals they also owned. After navigating the high walls, automatic gates, and intercom systems that form part of these residences, we headed to the next location. The next point of call on our plotted map was a panelist situated in the Bo-Kaap. This area was formerly known as the Malay Quarter and is a historical center of Cape Muslim culture. Situated on the slopes of Signal Hill above the city center, it was first established in 1760 by Jan de Waal, who bought this block of land and built several small huurhuisjes, or rental houses, on this land, which he leased to his enslaved people. As stipulated before, these enslaved individuals were initially brought to the Cape by the Dutch from Indonesia, the Indian subcontinent, and other parts of Africa, and were known collectively as Cape Malay. Most of the new residents of the Bo-Kaap were Muslim, and several mosques were built in the area. But it was also home to other ethnicities, such as Africans, Portuguese, and Italian immigrants. Under the Group Areas Act of 1950, the non-Malay residents were, however, forcibly removed in accordance with the Act, in an effort by the government to preserve what they felt were the Malay character of the area. It continued to remain a Cape Muslim community, fiercely proud of their heritage, with calls to prayer ringing out throughout the week and the waft of spices drifting out of restaurants and home kitchens. After our Bo-Kaap delivery, we were supposed to head out along the N2 National Highway for what Google stipulated as a 32-minute journey to the township called Mafuleni. It is a testament to the disenfranchisement of this community that Jade and I conversed the day before, whether we felt safe as two females traveling alone into an area that we were not familiar with, and that is known for its gang violence and shootings. Mafuleni is a relatively new township, the smaller neighbor to the older and far larger Khayelitsha, which was established in the 1980s as one of the apartheid regime's final attempts to enforce the Group Areas Act. 1.2 million people call Khayelitsha their home, and 90% of Cape Town's Black population live here. 70% of the residents live in shacks, and 1 in 3 must walk 200 meters or more to access water. In addition to the challenge of basic amenities, as someone who works in the city, you have to travel in the many minibus taxis along the congested highways each morning and evening. And as a student who attends school or university, I have to battle with the lack of internet provision. I've only picked out a few details about some of the deliveries we made, but in the span of the 4 examples, many of the topics and themes alluded to in the exhibition and discussed in the symposium surfaced in this quotidian of activities. And therein lie a call to action, of becoming cognizant of the myriad ways the present is embedded with these past injustices, and to learn how to uncover and to acknowledge them.
Now I can thank you, Nina.
Sorry, a bit longer than it should have been. Sorry, Aaron.
Well, thank you all very, very much. First compliments for your splendid work come from Gert-Jan, and also the first question. With regard to the colonial marginalized, I would like to know whether you draw explicit links with specific colonizers, rulers, exploiters in order to contextualize them.
I can speak to that. I mean, absolutely. I think the work that we are doing find different manifestations in different forms. So in one sense, the exhibition really particularly looks at women and these enslaved women and Khoikhoi women. But in the broader research, I think especially, the social history, Ezekiel social history collection, a lot of the objects that we looked at came from the Dumini family. So that was definitely something we considered. But in my own writing as well, I've looked quite closely at Jan van Riebeeck, especially via the diaries that were published in the mid-1950s and translated by H.B. Tom. The difficulty with some of what, focusing on them in particular, is that a lot of the historical scholarship that came out of South Africa in the 20th century looked exactly at people like Van Riebeeck and the kind of the Breda families and the Simon van der Stels and Adrian van der Stels. So there is quite a lot of scholarship already on them, and quite a lot of writing already produced with that perspective. Historians in the late 80s, early 90s have challenged some of those mid-20th century perspectives, but it is really a kind of a moment in which to try and understand what is, what one misses by only looking, at those records. So yes, definitely, I think there's a conversation happening between preceding scholarship, preceding representations, and also trying to find its shadow, trying to find the ghosts. And one of the techniques I think that I have employed in particular is to think about imprints, of how to read colonial archives and documents, and in effect writing about it as where one can see where there's these imprints of absence, imprints of that which was kind of written out. And if one looks at someone like Anne-Laura Stoller, who also reads archives along the grain to find the frictions in them. So I think there's a lot of value to be done, but it is something that requires quite a sensitive methodology to hold in view, the force of historiography, the requirements of the present moment, and to understand how they intersect.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, so in total, you have decided to portray 12 women in this exhibition. And when I was looking through those different portraits, some women perished horribly in slavery, and other women, that was, for instance, Anzela, she became a slave owner herself.
Mm-hmm.
So you must have found many, many, many different lives to discover. How did you choose? On what basis did you choose which ones you would like to use for the exhibition?
As I indicated, I think Susanna and Kutua were where we started. So we wanted to, those were the kinds of starting points. And then from there, it was really to understand the vast variety, and I think the vast complexity of how lives unfolded, because I think it is quite easy at the moment to imagine one understands what happened because of a dominant narrative. There's a dominant narrative of oppression and suffering, and therefore, what the work that is needed is effectively to counter that. But in fact, these things are much more entangled in a much more complicated way, and to understand that, for example, the technology of colonialism and slavery is something that decided how making a living was possible. What was it? What could be done? How could you reclaim agency? How could you, gain freedom and assert some sort of economic prosperity for yourself as well? So I think that is, that is the it's not only about the individuals, but it is to form a picture of the various strata and various trajectories that were determined by this at this time. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. We have one more comment and a question from Susan. Thank you very much for the talks. My question is about the elegy Goliath. I was lucky to attend a version of the elegy in Amsterdam and was deeply impressed also because by listening to the women singing one note in different voices, one came to hear more and more overtones. I now realize that a bell also produces such overtones. What I would like to ask is how the elegy and the objects worked for the visitors. How did the two go together?
So elegy, as I said, there was a performance of elegy that in a sense it was an hour long, where visitors to the opening watched for an hour this first. So in other words, there was this moment of remembrance before any of the exhibition could be seen. So I think in that sense we kind of controlled the movement of visitors. But in the exhibition itself, once it was open, I think that the interesting thing about Gabrielle's elegy, as I said, that the note penetrated throughout the exhibition. So once you were looking at copper manillas, or you were looking at this lace that was made by Malati, and the dresses, and you were reading the stories, you were in a sense almost unconsciously becoming aware of this sound, so that by the time that you arrive, I think that room was quite empty, it was quite dark, and became actually space for contemplation after having read all of these varied but very sad stories, most of them. So I think it's almost in the bell was there, but just very mutely placed. But then it was almost like just at least imagined as a space for that kind of reflection. I don't know, Jade, if you wanted to maybe say something about what the experience was in the space.
It's a very haunting sound. Obviously, I think there's a recording of it on our website if anyone wants to watch it. And it kind of, it works really well in drawing you through the exhibition. It starts out really faint and you walk through 3 rooms until you come to this very dark space where the audio kind of takes over, and it's, yeah. But there's a tour of the full show on the website. I think it's a 360-degree tour, if anyone would like to go and look at it.
Yeah, actually, there's on your website, right? There's a 360 degrees virtual tour of the museum where you can explore the different exhibition rooms. I saw that. It looks very beautiful. That's very, very great to have. Very much. I have one more question for you, Jade. Now, you showed us this map before of where you live and where the slave lodge, for instance, is situated. What is the awareness of the people who live there or who walk there every day about these places of memory that are, let's say, not marked as such, but you, of course, know of this history of violence, and so what do you think?
I think there's very little awareness. People come into town to do their business, and that's what their focus is. I think by way of my business being heritage and history, I'm hyper aware of things. So my route to work is walking right up against past the slave lodge and through the company's gardens, and then Michaelis School of Fine Art is at the end of the company's gardens. And so I've always found it a really jarring experience to walk past this building that is that carries so much painful and dark history, and then I look around at the other pedestrians and everyone's just going about their business. But I guess that's what a city is meant to be. A city is meant to live and continue its story, and maybe we are the ones who are responsible for keeping the stories of the past alive.
Okay, thank you very much. I have one more question from Ivo. Can you say a bit more on why you avoided to show the manacles?
I think my thinking there was mostly that there are those images and objects associated with the history of slavery that have become so ubiquitous and have become almost the symbols that these histories hang onto, in a sense that somehow become numb to them, but also their resonances have become rather stereotyped, that they have become almost predetermined by when they're used in Hollywood movies or used in, they get used in very particular ways. And because the exhibition from the beginning wanted to say something, wanted to talk about presence, wanted to talk about life, wanted to talk about all those things that we can't get at in archives and collections, that the manacles and their resonances seem to run quite a lot counter to that. So it was about a strategy of defamiliarization throughout. So they were using ash, using various kinds of images of spaces where the women would have walked, etc. Were not intended to depict anything, but to kind of connect with us on a more unconscious level, to connect on, to sidestep the conscious associations and the ways in which the history has been narrated so often. So that, I think that was where that decision came from. I hope that answers you.
Okay. Well, perfect. Thank you very much for taking time to answer all the questions. Well, time's up, and well, I would like to thank you for your very insightful and interesting presentations. And as I said, all the lives of the women in your exhibition are also documented on your website. Please do visit the website for the virtual tour of the museum. Everybody, thank you for participating. Please stay tuned for more webinars to follow in this series, and you will be informed by email and on the Clue Plus website of the FU. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Aaron and Jade and Nina and Clue Plus.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.